Greetings and welcome there, academic proletariat, to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will be talking about reform movements in American history and hopefully answering the question, why so many and why don't they ever work? So, to begin things off, let's talk about how today's presentation will be organized. We're going to talk about these reform movements in their sort of period-based chronology. And it's essential that we understand that all of these reform movements are usually responses to massive social, political, or usually economic change. And all of them are usually preceded by some sort of conservative period, and then are succeeded or followed by another conservative period. So it's like a pendulum that swings back and forth. The reform movements that we'll talk about in today's presentation is Antebellum Reform, of course, the stuff that happened before the Civil War, namely between 1820 and 1848. We'll drop a little note on Reconstruction and then pick up back with an intensive on the Progressive era and the New Deal era. And then also, I just don't want anybody to lose sight of or forget the fact that the Civil Rights Movement and Great Society were also massive reform movements in American history. But because of the current circumstances, we will not be talking about those, unfortunately. Okay, so for each of these, I'm going to provide to you a prompt from a DBQ that has actually been given by the College Board in the past. And then I'll give you my take on how one would organize that question and then talk about the details that could possibly go into an essay on the topic. Okay, so to begin with, the Antebellum Reform period that, like we said, took place pretty much at the same time in the market revolution, 1820 to 1848. Here's a question that the College Board has used in the past. Evaluate the extent to which religious ideas of the Second Great Awakening shaped reform movements in the first half of the 19th century. So it's one of those questions that talks about shaped. So whenever I see shaped, I usually think cause and effect, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Anyways, if this were my essay, here's how I would organize it. I would read the documents and I would try and discern which of the reform movements the documents mostly talk about, and then organize my body paragraphs accordingly. So I would have Reform Movement 1, talk about the details in the documents, and of course make a connection to the Second Great Awakening, because that's a special caveat that the question has with it. And talk about Reform Movement 2 and Reform Movement 3 if I have time. All right, so that's just a little bit of an idea there on how I would go about it. Now here's the information that I would stash in such an essay. First, I have to begin by talking about what the context of the reform movement is. So this reform movement particularly is a response to changes that were brought about by the market revolution. This is, of course, the massive economic change that happened at the beginning of the 1800s. So this would include changes in work, domestic and family life, and so on. At the same time, you have an intensification of slavery because you couldn't get a market economy in the North without cotton from the South. All right, so this is what Antebellum Reform is responding to. Now, in terms of developments and details during the antebellum period, let's begin with the Second Great Awakening, because that's kind of the catalyst that spawns all the rest of it. This is, of course, a religious movement that was predicated on the fact that people could be saved or they could reach salvation through social and or good works out in the community. So whereas the First Great Awakening was more individual, this one is going to be more communal. So do good works in the community and you shall be saved. It was, of course, led most notably by a preacher named Charles Grandison Finney and large outdoor gatherings. Now, it spurred various reforms in other aspects of society. So let's talk about general societal reform first. There are two examples within this very vast umbrella that are worth taking note of, one of which is public schooling efforts. And public schooling efforts were led by Horace Mann, who was a public education bureaucrat from Massachusetts. He sort of is the father of public education in America. And then you have Dorothea Dix, who's leading a movement for inmate and patient care, predominantly in asylums and places like that. Next, you have the abolition movement, which is closely tied to the Second Great Awakening because, you know, people were trying to make slavery into a sin, which of course it is. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass are the champions here, and also don't want to forget the Grimke sisters for two reasons. One, because it's important to note that women were closely tied to the abolition movement, but that also the Grimke sisters were from the South, so there were Southerners that were involved in abolition as well. Transcendentalism is a more cultural and social outgrowth of the Second Great Awakening that resulted in people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau writing incredibly convoluted books that tried to encourage people to go back to their roots with nature and find individualism and salvation that way instead of in a new market economy. It was incredibly critical of things like trains and industrialism, and then would eventually become very critical of territorial expansion. Finally, women's rights and temperance movement, that kind of two go together. This was, of course, highlighted by the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was sort of the climax of the women's movement during this time period. It was sort of headlined by the reading of the Declaration of Sentiments, a document written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Of course, it was modeled off the Declaration of Independence to prove that women play just as much of a role in society as men do, and they should be afforded more rights as a result. Now, this one's kind of unique in that there's no direct conservative reaction to antebellum reform. There is an increase in sectional tensions that arises, mostly though because of abolition. People in the South weren't necessarily mad at Horace Mann for suggesting compulsory public schools. However, the Civil War does throw a massive wrench into all of these reform movements. It kind of puts anything that was on the reform agenda on hold because there was a massive conflagration that needed to be taken care of. However, in terms of advocating for immigration reform and advocacy of new people in America, you of course get the reactionary party known as the Know Nothings, and then of course Southern angst around abolition and increased rights for Black Americans is sort of underlying this entire thing. Okay, so now moving on to Reconstruction. We'll try and go through this one quick because it's been highlighted already in our review circuit. So the question here: analyze the major changes and continuities in social and constitutional developments in the United States between 1860 and 1877. So if this were my essay, I would organize it in terms of changes and continuities, but since the question directly asks for attention to social and constitutional, and by constitutional they mean political, of course, I have to work those in. So in my changes paragraph, I might try to have social and constitutional points as well as my continuity paragraphs, but I'm not naive enough to think that that would be possible for all students. So if you only talked about constitutional change and only talked about social continuity, because that I think would be the easiest route to go, you wouldn't be penalized for something like that. Anyways, here's my suggested organization for that essay. So now, real quick on Reconstruction. Reconstruction, of course, was a response to, in the institution of slavery, of course, and then secession and the Civil War, both rather conservative movements, especially if we're talking about the South. Now, important developments and details that took place that might be able to be thrown out there to answer that question is this process began with presidential Reconstruction that sought to take a lenient approach to Reconstruction. It was begun by Lincoln and carried on by Johnson, and then it allowed the South back into the Union much more quickly than many of the South's critics would have wanted. And as a result, you get a South that rises very quickly and without much of a barrier. So as a result of that, progressives, or radicals as they were called at the time, because supporting Black people throughout American history is the radical thing to do, they take the reins of Reconstruction, and this is where they pass things like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is a predecessor to the 14th Amendment, the Freedmen's Bureau that sought to broker relations between freed slaves and whites in the South, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that if you don't know what those did by now, you should consider yourself in trouble, and so on. This, of course, was led by a cadre of congressmen known as the Radical Republicans. They were championed by Thaddeus Stevens and one Charles Sumner. Now, the conservative reaction to Reconstruction is typical and to be expected. Of course, instead of slavery now, white plantation owners in the South who got their plantations back because things had initially been so lenient turned to sharecropping or crop lien systems in order to sort of keep Black Americans tied to the land. You also see the emergence of violence in general in terms of the KKK and other white terror groups. And then, of course, the Compromise of 1877, which gives the South back control over Reconstruction, and then the ensuing redemption period that lasts roughly from 1877 to 1965. Depends on when you want to put an end on that one. And that's of course characterized by Jim Crow, Plessy versus Ferguson, poll taxes, literacy tests, restrictions on voting, and so on and so on. This is, of course, a more nuanced conversation that can be found elsewhere on my YouTube channel, or if you have any questions at the end, I'd be happy to take them. Okay, so let's move on to the Progressive Era, and this is by far the most meaty of all of them. And let me just tell you that currently the head of the Test Development Committee for the College Board is a historian of the Progressive Era. Now, I'm not saying that we should assume anything there, but it just sounds something to look out for. Anyways, question that you might see with regard to the Progressive Era is evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. So it's explicitly focused on politics, and it wants to know about change. So if this is my essay, then I'm going to organize it by changes and continuities, of course, focusing on the political, because that's what the question wants me to do. And then I'll use documents and details that are either provided in the document set or outside information that I might know to fill in those blanks. And then at the end, I might make an argument. Okay, so here's some essential information about the Progressive Era. First of all, the Progressive Era is a response to the Gilded Age and the rise of industrial capitalism in the late 18 and early 1900s in America. No more needed to be said there. So moving on to important developments and details. Well, the Progressive Era is chock full of specifics. So hopefully you're able to stay with me here. Let's start at the national level and talk about how presidents really molded the day. Progressive presidents, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, who were responding to the Gilded Age sort of absentee presidents like Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and the people you've never heard of. They wanted to take a more active role, and as a result, they play a more prominent role both in political and public life. This is best exemplified by Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal, where he basically makes his domestic agenda a call for progressive action. He wants to focus more on the conservation movement, and he sees through the passing of the Antiquities Act, which helps preserve Western landscapes. He wants to protect consumers, which of course is best connected to the writing of the Meat Inspection Act, and then later the Food and Drug Administration. Of course, this was spurred by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, but more on him in a second. And then he wanted to control corporations, which of course led to Theodore Roosevelt being dubbed the Trust Buster. Now, in reality, he was more of a trust regulator because he did let some slide. Now, moving away from the presidents, but still focusing on the national, you see there be a frustration with the level of cooperation between Democrats and Republicans and big business. Even though Theodore Roosevelt and the Democratic Party were challenging some big business tendencies of American life, for the most part, they were complicit with big business's rise. They saw it as a benefit for Americans. And as a result of that, they get a challenge from a third party, the Populist Party, in 1892. Now, of course, we all know what happens to them eventually, that they will be co-opted by William Jennings Bryan and the Democratic Party in 1896. They will lose and they will sort of fade away, only to be remembered as the allegory to which The Wizard of Oz is based on. Okay, fine. In the Supreme Court, which is, of course, the most conservative of all branches of American government, you see two cases that really put a difficult stamp on progressivism. Mueller versus Oregon is a landmark Supreme Court decision that dubs the right of states to limit how long women can work constitutional. That, of course, is done in a paternalistic way to say that women need to be protected by male politicians and that they should only be able to work 10 hours. But really, progressives are on board with this because they don't want to see women and other workers being taken advantage of. So interestingly enough, progressives are on board with some conservative actions. The other one, Lochner versus New York, which which allows big businesses to ignore state limitations on working hours, is also another one where progressives are okay with this because they don't want to see they don't want to see workers work too much, but the Supreme Court undoes that by saying, oh no, it's okay. Corporations can decide working hours. You can work people to the bone. Nevertheless, there's a progressive impetus in national politics as well. Now, on a local level, there's more to be fought because, of course, political machines are running politics in all of the cities. And as a result of that, local politicians have their hands tied. They do make headway, though, in places like Wisconsin and California, where they have movements such as initiative, referendum, and recall. Now, these are basically things that local government officials can do to change their situation. So initiative is something that can be put on a ballot, as can referendum, to challenge the power block that they're up against. And then recall is a new ability for local government officials to recall or basically call for the stepping down of a local government official that might have overstepped his bounds or violated the rules. Local politics is championed by Robert La Follette, who is a socialist politician from Wisconsin. Okay, so moving aside from the explicitly political realm, let's move into ones that have more of an existential pressure on politics, and that would be muckrakers. So there's a long list there. Upton Sinclair, who of course fought against the meatpacking industry, but then other efforts as well. I mean, he's the author of over 100 books. Lincoln Steffens, who challenged workplace safety and political machines. Ida Tarbell challenged corporations, particularly Standard Oil. Ida B. Wells, lynching in the South. Jacob Riis, living conditions in tenements in New York. And Lewis Hine, child labor. You take your pick. Muckrakers are putting pressure on politicians to try and get them to change their ways. Now, additionally, you have social reforms that are tied up in the political because they're putting pressure on politicians to make and pass new laws. So in terms of immigration, you see Jane Addams and her settlement housework. In terms of race relations, you see Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and their battle over what direction America should take in terms of improving the lot of Black Americans. Women's rights, Margaret Sanger advocates for birth control. And then, of course, you have the suffrage movement, which culminates in the 19th Amendment that was led by activists such as Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, there is a massive conservative reaction against the progressive era, namely the decade of the 1920s, which takes the cultural and social movements that the progressives had championed, allows them to continue, but really turns back any sort of economic regulations or redistribution of wealth that the progressive era had hit upon. Okay, so lastly, that brings us to the New Deal. And here's a potential question there. Explain the extent to which President FDR's New Deal changed the role of federal government in the lives of Americans between 1933 and 1941. So basically, how did the New Deal change the relationship between the government and its people? All right, so it's another change question. And here I would organize it like I did the other ones. You have a change paragraph, a continuity paragraph, and then you let the documents pretty much tell you where to go in terms of your argument and or organization of the documents. And so this is a response to the Great Depression, of course, which was the result of the trickle-down economic scheme that had been trolled out there in the 1920s. Important developments, obviously this list can be very, very long, so let's try and condense it as much as we can. First thing to note is that it's a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the people. Very much changed here. You'd be hard-pressed to argue that the New Deal represents a continuity. It does in some aspects, like keeping capitalism alive and not doing anything to rid America of a lot of its racist tendencies. But for the most part, everyday life was incredibly different after the New Deal than it was before. So when FDR busts on the scene, he of course engages in a couple of emergency banking efforts where he closes down all of the banks, creates this bank holiday and the Emergency Banking Act, which allows for the government to appropriate funds to keep those banks open and running. When they get back open, provide funds to allow them to stay open. Okay, so then of course the New Deal is split up into three categories or periods or goals: relief, recovery, and reform. They overlap chronologically in some cases, so it's not exactly chronological, but for the most part, the relief happened first, and then the recovery, and then the reform. So relief efforts include things like FERA, or the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, which of course just wanted to give money to people to put in their pockets, but it was a very limited amount and didn't really overstep its bounds because the government was worried about people becoming too reliant upon the government. The CCC, which put young men between the ages of 18 and 25, predominantly white young men, to work. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which of course brought electricity to places in Appalachia that didn't have it, but then also allowed for a lot of people to be put to work, because if you're going to build several hydroelectric dams, you're going to need people to use their labor to build it. Moving on then to recovery, you have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which retooled America's agricultural relations to pay farmers to not make as much, but then also incentivize them in the future to also not make as much. And then the National Recovery Act, which sort of tried to reorganize businesses along more regulated routes so that they wouldn't engage in massive speculation, and they wouldn't engage in stock trading that was faulty, and they would have limits on how much they would produce, and so on and so on. And then finally, you have reform. These were New Deal programs that were intended to fix things for the long haul. The Security Exchange Act, which creates the Security Exchange Commission, which of course limits and tries to police insider trading on Wall Street so that you don't have a massive crash on Wall Street again. The National Labor Relations Act, which of course was a government agency that brokers relations between businesses and its workers. It's still around today. Imagine our current president and who he might have appointed to that. Anyways, this is also the thing that oversees the protection of the Wagner Act, which is a law that allows for workers to unionize and restricts an employer's ability to tell them no. And then Social Security Administration, which of course gives money in the form of welfare benefits to the elderly, unemployed, and disabled Americans. Conservative reaction, obviously it had its conservative critics at the time, Huey Long and Father Coughlin. Now there are interesting types of conservatives, I would say. Huey Long is only conservative in the fact that he wanted like a totalitarian state to oversee a much broader redistribution of wealth. Father Coughlin literally wanted fascism. So obviously interesting types of conservatives there. But the more prominent and the more influential conservative reaction came from big business interests, namely the Republican Party and big business that was able to make its way through the Great Depression. Southern politicians, of course, are exerting pressure on the New Deal for anything that it tried to do to explicitly address the race situation in America. And then finally, much of the undoing of the New Deal comes after World War II in the decades of the late 40s and 1950s. Okay, so that draws to a close our discussion of the various eras, but I wanted to share with you a quote from an author, Barbara Ehrenreich, who says that middle-class-led reform movements from the Progressive Era to the War on Poverty, and you can throw in Antebellum and Reconstruction there, have been marred by an elitist distance from the would-be beneficiaries of reform. So what Barbara Ehrenreich is saying there is that in American history, you see a continuity, that these reform movements are usually led not from the bottom, but from the upper middle. And as a result, there is little that is done except for paternalism in the realm of these reform movements. So with that said, we will move on to a Q&A.